This episode is brought to you by Merrill. We all have goals, and we all want to get to those goals, whether that's saving for a home renovation, that once-in-a-lifetime trip to your favourite Grand Prix, or even retirement. We all want a straightforward path to those goals, but the real world doesn't usually work that way. Merrill understands that. That's why with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalised plan and a clear path forward. And having the bull at your back helps your whole financial life move with you. So when your plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and with F1's racing rules creating confusion, Max Verstappen extending his points lead and rookies continuing to impress, there's plenty of unanswered questions for us to tackle from listeners. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to face the latest interrogation from the master ranks of the Race Members Club are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Josh Suttill. Well, Scott, we'll come to you first. By the time people are listening to this, you'll probably be on your way to join me in this part of the world for the Mexican Grand Prix. I say this part of the world, I'm not in Mexico, but I'm not far from Mexico.
Yeah, careful. You don't want to come across like an accidental Helmut Marko and conflate different parts of America into one giant landmass where all the countries are the same, essentially, or get the hemispheres the wrong way around. It's up to you, really, how you want to be geographically incorrect, I suppose. But I will be on my way to Mexico. You're correct by the time this comes out, I suspect. Not looking forward to my early morning taxi, but I'm very much looking forward to being back in that part of the world. Mexico is one of my favourite countries to visit, one of my favourite kind of cultures to embrace. Don't have a huge amount of time there, but it's going to be enjoyable, I'm sure. It's one of the best paddocks as well.
Yeah, very much so. In fact, this is a great triple header. Austin, Mexico, Brazil, 3 fantastic races. But yeah, I'm not far from Mexico. I'm in San Antonio at the moment, which is a little bit south of Austin. You might be able to hear in the background some planes landing because I'm staying near the airport. But yeah, I've got a much shorter hop to Mexico City than you have. And Josh, you're not going to be joining us in Mexico, but as ever, you've been following things very, very closely. Is this a race you like from afar, Mexico?
Absolutely. I'm really glad it's come back on the calendar. It's, I think, always has that potential to be a bit of an outlier. You're never quite sure what's going to happen all the way up there with that big altitude. So, yeah, I'm very looking forward to it.
Excellent. Yes, it certainly makes it interesting with the air density. Yeah, just high downforce packages and high downforce trim, but the level of downforce is not very high as a result, plus strangles the engines. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting weekend. But for now, we've got questions, and mainly those emerge from the United States Grand Prix. As always, thanks to everyone who sent questions in. It's so hard to get to all of them. If we don't answer a question, it's still valid. Feel free to send it in again, because we just have so many, and there's so many good questions. I'd love to answer every single one because they're pretty much all good. But yeah, there's some limits on time. But if you want to get involved in the Race Members Club and benefit from being able to ask us questions, listen to the exclusive members-only podcasts, which includes our Bring Back V10 special series on 1997, also ad-free listening and much more, you can head to Patreon and search for The Race, or click the link in the episode description. We're going to start off with talking about the racing rules and track limits, Scott, because inevitably there were countless questions about the racing rules, the controversies in the Norris versus Verstappen battle, and matters related to that. And obviously we talked about those on the podcast after the Austin race, but we're going to address it again, looking a little bit more broadly in terms of exactly what the racing rules say, as there is a bit of misunderstanding around that, partly because they have evolved over the years. So thanks to everyone who asked questions in and around this topic, including Jasper Pendlebury, Hayden Hodgson, Adam Barton, Sam Douglas, Oscar Robledo, William Seymour, John O'Hara, Ross Cook, William Breen, Sebastian Russo, and Hannah Partridge. So first up, let's get to the foundation of this. Exactly what do the racing rules state, and how are they therefore applied, using Austin as a case study?
Okay, let's. We'll need to break this down into chunks, otherwise I'll be talking for 11 minutes straight, and nobody needs that. I do my best anyway when I go rogue with some of my answers, but we don't need to formalise that as the structure of the podcast. Why don't we start with a clarification that there are some racing rules or guidelines, whatever you want to call them, that did the rounds in early 2022 because they were devised off the back of, obviously, the controversial end to 2021, the Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton battles and moments, Brazil 2021 in particular, where Verstappen crossed the line, and it felt like it would be beneficial for everybody to understand what isn't and isn't allowed, and guidelines were conceived to allow for that. That happened in 2022. At the start of 2024, this year, new guidelines were created that were slightly different. They were an evolution of that off the back of that original set of guidelines, plus feedback and how it had worked in reality in the two intervening seasons. The idea behind this kind of new 2024 set of guidelines is that it will be rolled out as the de facto racing rules for all FIA circuit racing. And it will actually be enshrined in the FIA International Sporting Code as of 2025, but it is in effect for F1 this year. That is what is being used as the reference point for the stewards this year. It was sent round, I believe, to the F1, F2 and F3 drivers and teams at the start of this season. So if you see snippets of a document from 2022, if you're basing your interpretation of the racing rules on the 2022 stuff, that is out of date, and that is significant because as I say, some of the rules have changed. Before we go any further, it is probably worth briefly addressing the fact that the reason this is not any fan's fault for not knowing this, because the FIA has chosen to reference the fact these guidelines exist, but has never published them, as far as I'm aware. My suspicion is that they're waiting until they're part of the ISC and whatever final form that takes. But seeing as that they are actively being referenced in stewards' documents, I don't know how you feel about this, Ed and Josh, but it's ridiculous to me that we don't have a published set. And bear in mind, we only have the 2022 ones published because they were sent round, I think it was Imola 2022, to the F2 and F3 drivers. It was a junior series stewards document that was issued. I don't believe they ever actually got fully published from an F1 perspective.
Yeah, this has caused so much of the animosity because, them not being public is what's creating all the confusion, because fans are arguing, but they don't have the actual details of what the stewards are basing it on. And I'm not always sure there's absolute evidence that all of the stewards are going to the same guidelines or have the same level of understanding of the guidelines. And I think that's where we're getting some of the kind of inconsistencies between races, because of course the stewards are changing, and it's a problem we talked about before, but it seems particularly problematic here with such an in-depth set of guidelines, which are only guidelines, they're not rules. So it is partly down to some interpretation. They're not quite the hardline rules, I think, that some people think they are.
Yeah, I do think generally publishing these sorts of things would make a lot of sense. The FIA often talk about transparency, Mohammed bin Sulayem has, and I don't really understand why you have something in place that isn't made public, especially when previous versions have been made public, because that creates a lot of the confusion. I'm very much enjoying the drilling going on in the background, Josh. So I've got planes, you've got drills. Hopefully nothing will be interrupting Scott, because he's got a lot to explain.
Yes, so let's have a look. So what I'll do, first of all, I'll just very quickly explain what was in the 2022 guidelines, because it's very important to understand where they differ and how they differ. So 2022, way it was established, so on the inside of a corner, to be given racing room, effectively, overtaking on the inside, you needed to have a significant portion of the car alongside. It had to be safe and controlled, and your car had to stay within the limits of the track. What was defined or considered a significant portion of the car was effectively if the overtaking car's front tyres were alongside the other car by no later than the apex. For the outside of a corner, overtaking on the outside, to earn space through the corner and on the exit, the overtaking car needed to have a significant portion of the car alongside, safe and controlled, stay within the limits of the track, all the same, but the significant portion of the car changed. It was that if the overtaking car on the outside is ahead of the other car from the apex of the corner. Crucially, it also said the car being overtaken must be capable of making the corner while remaining within the limits of the track. So, Ed, you mentioned using what happened in Austin as an example. Under those rules, what Verstappen did against Norris, I believe, would have been illegal. Because Norris was making the pass on the outside, and the car being overtaken wasn't capable of making the corner while remaining within the limits of the track. It was based on what Norris did, but obviously not Verstappen. So I think there'd have been grounds there for the stewards to take action. I'll leave it at inside and outside, because there is some guidance on chicanes and S-bends. We can get into that a little bit later, but it's inherently the same. What it says for 2024, first of all, there is a bit of preamble in the 2024 guidelines. I think it's quite a good thing that they acknowledge that racing is dynamic and that there are lots of other factors to consider beyond specified relative positions of cars on track. So it's not just about where you are at the apex. There's other things that get factored in as well. So was there late braking or diving in involved, moving under braking? Were either the driver being late or optimistic with their moves, stuff like that. Even things like relative tyres and tyre age. So what the guidelines actually say, overtaking on the inside of a corner, you need to have your front axle at least alongside of the mirror of the other car no later than the apex. So that's on the inside. And before, obviously, it was if the front tyres were alongside the other car. So that's a slight change. Then it's the same, safe and controlled. There's a reference to without deliberately forcing the other car off the track at the exit and being able to make the corner within the track limits. That track limits requirement is also there for overtaking on the outside of a corner, as is safe and controlled manner. Where it's different if you're overtaking on the outside, which is what Norris was trying to do with Verstappen, is you need to have the front axle at least alongside the front axle of the other car at the apex of the corner and to the exit. Now, clearly in Austin, Norris didn't have that. He wasn't ahead at the apex, and he wasn't alongside at the apex, and he certainly wasn't alongside at the exit of the corner. Now, the reason for that is obviously in part because Verstappen braked later into the corner and actually braked so late that he couldn't get the car stopped and stay on track. But there is no reference in these guidelines to the car being overtaken staying on track, which effectively means unless you're wildly out of control, and I don't know what it would take for the stewards to deem you wildly out of control, you get ahead at the
maybe
apex.
Maybe a lock-up or visibly sideways, something like that. Some kind of moment like that.
Yeah. You get ahead at the apex, and you get ahead at the exit of the corner. You don't have to stay on track, and you don't need to leave your rival room. So you can... It basically, inside and outside, the best way of summarising it is that these rules enable quite aggressive defensive driving. And I think Verstappen is very, very good at exploiting that, because that gels very nicely with his natural defensive driving style.
If you go off track, arguably that is sort of driving in an uncontrolled manner, right? Because even if there's not a lock-up, if you're kind of braking a little bit too late and you run slightly off track, you can kind of argue that's a bit uncontrolled. And that's where the guidelines to me fall down a little bit, because what is driving in an uncontrolled manner. There's different interpretations here. There can be different interpretations to people listening. So I think that creates a bit of kind of, what does that really mean? And that could be interpreted differently, I think, by different people.
But it's also significant because you could also interpret differently is when does something become overtaking on the outside and overtaking on the inside? One example I would say with Verstappen and Norris is that if Norris has got his front wheels ahead of Verstappen on the straight before they get into the braking zone, Verstappen's the one coming back at Norris in terms of vehicle dynamics, in terms of where they are positionally. So you could argue that in that situation, is it not better to apply the rules for overtaking on the inside of a corner on Verstappen rather than overtaking on the outside for Norris? Because similar levels of physics and vehicle dynamics and racing reality applies in that scenario. This is part of the problem with trying to codify it, because you try to create this set of rules or guidelines, because they aren't binding rules, but guidelines for the stewards for a situation where you can impose different elements on different incidents or case studies or whatever that look fundamentally the same at face value, but actually have are completely different in terms of who is where, who is aggressor, who is defender, what the corner profile is. Are there natural track limits or deterrents on the outside of the track, or is there a load of runoff? I know it's a pet peeve of yours, Ed, like this attempt to try and over-regulate, and I would say where they fall down is that they're ultra-specific in some areas, but they leave massive wiggle room in others.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very difficult thing to do, because when you read the rules as they are, there's nothing you look at and say, oh, that's preposterous, that's ridiculous. But it's the constant problem. You're trying to codify in the written word, in absolute terms, a huge, broad range of incidents. And it's all trying to get consistency, and that's fine. But it doesn't describe all scenarios. And as you say, there's the preamble to get a little bit of wriggle room. But of course, the drivers, and Verstappen is brilliant at this, no matter whether you like the way he does it or not, the simple fact is he knows the guidelines really well and he plays to them absolutely beautifully. He is so good at doing that. And as soon as you create those guidelines, that's what that allows you to do. And I'm a little bit careful about anything that creates kind of an entitlement for where you are at a certain point in the corner, and that allows you to do certain things. It becomes a bit of a box-ticking exercise. And as I've always said, in order for racing to work, because it's so dynamic, because it's two moving cars that are moving relative to each other, but within the bounds of an immovable track, it becomes very, very difficult to be absolute. Derek Warwick was one of the stewards in Austin, and those who've listened to the Members Club podcast I did with him, the book club interview about his book, which is excellent, by the way. He said, well, if you want absolute consistency from stewarding on this, you've got to make sure every incident is exactly consistent in terms of speed, conditions, got all these sorts of things. And that's the thing. I understand the desire to have it clear and consistent and everything, but I just don't think it works in a messy world, which is why I like a little bit more wriggle room. But while the rules are there, the drivers have to drive to them.
What would you propose instead, Ed? If they got rid of these guidelines, what do you think the better solution would be?
Well, people have a pretty good idea of what is and isn't reasonable when you're racing on track. And by having these rules, you create a situation where drivers kind of can set that aside and say, well, I fulfilled this, therefore I can do pretty much whatever. And it's very, very difficult, because my argument is basically you need to have less guidance and more flexibility and more judgment, which I think can be made relatively consistent with perhaps a permanent stewards panel. I mean, there's still a small pool of stewards, so it's pretty good, but that's one way of doing it. But then, of course, people might have a problem with one steward and say, oh, there's bias there. So it's complicated. But I think unless you accept the whole scenario, the whole situation is quite messy and nuanced and conditions vary, unless you accept that, and that therefore the way you regulate it has to be a little bit vague and imprecise and based on experience and the kind of more heuristic approach to things rather than precise guidelines, unless you accept those two things go together, you do have to have this more regulated thing. Then you have to accept that they will be applied in the way they're applied, even if you don't like it. So it depends. What's the lesser of two evils? Because it's not a binary thing. It's not a yes or no. It's not 0 or 1. Neither solution is perfect, so it's which do you want? I tend to think less regulation, more judgment, is better. You can have a few guidelines within that, but that's my sort of view on it. Others would say, well, it's better if it's absolute.
I think the way that the guidelines are now, there are elements of it that are actually okay. They're fairly sensible.
Oh, the guidelines aren't stupid by any means.
But it's as I said before, it's where they're so specific in some areas, very vague in others, or don't even reference certain things in others. That's where it becomes stupid, because then you have guidelines that aren't very reliable for the people that are applying them. Because if you're trying to look at that Verstappen incident, and as a steward, because you can see it by how divisive the incident was, and I saw it with some of the stuff that I got on social media in the aftermath of it, it was almost exactly 50-50 in terms of the response, with people saying that Norris was the one that was completely in the wrong, and people saying that it was a slam dunk and Norris shouldn't have got a penalty because Verstappen was in the wrong. So it's very divisive. It's obviously going to be subjective. But you can't be subjective as a steward and make your own judgment if the rules make no reference. If the guidelines say that the driver defender on the outside doesn't have to stay on the track, why would you factor that in as the steward?
No, the stewards did nothing wrong in terms of the way they interpreted it. That's the position they're put in. They're always locked into exactly what the regs say, not what people think should be the case.
And it's a little bit more. There's a little bit more interpretation for them with these guidelines, because they are exactly that. But then, as I say, the guidelines get so specific in some areas. How much wiggle room do you really have? And the bit I didn't understand at first on Sunday evening, when this was the fallout of this was obviously at its peak, and I've sort of, purely because I have the luxury of knowing what the guidelines say, and I can reference them, but it's mad that they get referenced so vaguely in the stewards' documents. I wish the explanations from the FIA stewards were more emphatic than they are. But it took quite a while for me to kind of get to a point of going, okay, well, no, Verstappen hasn't done anything wrong to the letter of the guidelines. I don't think, anyway, as best as I can interpret them. And I can sort of now see the stewards' rationale for it. But I have an issue, not with what Max did necessarily, because I think if those are the guidelines and that's what you're allowed to do, why wouldn't you do them? Because they benefit you. That way of driving benefits you more often than not. But the bit that I still struggle to reconcile is how a set of guidelines can exist whereby, yes, a driver completing a move off track shouldn't be allowed. I understand that and I agree with that completely. But I struggle to understand how a set of guidelines can exist that mean you basically are encouraged to, either as the defending car, you're encouraged to brake really, really late. And even if you just go off track and push your rival wide, that's okay because you've got ahead at the apex. Or as the overtaking car on the outside, what is your option there beyond don't go off track? Just let the crash happen because the car on the inside is going to come across. And then what? Hope that they get a penalty for causing a collision or going off track and gaining whatever it's going to be. I don't like that. That's the kind of situation those racing guidelines effectively leave us in.
Yeah, I think this is the problem, and you can play them because take the start move for example, which again was perfectly fine by the guidelines. But obviously, people said, "Why didn't Norris cover the inside?" Well, he did, and you have this situation where if you're defending in that situation, if you leave a bit of space on the inside, you're thinking, right, in order for you to take that tighter line and turn the corner inside my car, you will have to approach the corner with a certain degree of conservatism. But if you're allowed to sort of push the car off, that allows you to brake a little bit later on the inside. And so you tick those boxes, but you're only able to get into that position to tick those boxes because you have the facility to push. And that's the difficult thing, I think, where you can use these guidelines to put yourself in a position that isn't quite right, but because it buys you a certain position in the middle of the move that you perhaps shouldn't have, that then qualifies you to do something that you otherwise wouldn't be at the exit. So that's where I find it very difficult.
One thing I think, because the two of you offer a good contrast in terms of what racing you've been exposed to, sort of in terms of forming your view of motor racing. Because when I was racing in karts, for example, so this would have been through the 2000s, and watching racing myself, every experience I had taught me that you were allowed to run your rival out of road on the exit as long as you had basically the advantage. If you were like side by side with them, you couldn't just shove them onto the grass, obviously, and you couldn't dangerously put someone onto the grass or into the barriers just when they'd got an overlap on you down the straight or something like that. I actually did that once in a kart race and rightly got black flagged for it because it was completely in the wrong. But one of the things that's happened over the last sort of 5 or 6 years or so is there's definitely been a trend at times towards punishing drivers who have run their rivals out of road at the exit. So I ask the two of you, what's fair? Should the driver on the inside, defending the inside, be allowed to run the driver off track on the driver on the outside off track at the exit? And if the answer to that is yes, what positional advantage do they need to have to be allowed to do that?
Well, I'm thinking of multiple examples and getting a different answer for those examples, which I think shows what part of the problem is, because it's very situational. You know, is the driver defending on the inside, do they have the capacity to actually turn a bit more and leave some space, or are they taking the sort of line which means naturally there is no space from them taking that line for a car on the outside? So to me, it kind of depends. The way I see racing is that if they can leave space, then they should. I don't think that they should just be able to run someone off the road if you're side by side, but if you can close the door, that seems like a fairly natural move to me. But it's just, I'm thinking of all these examples in my head, like saying, getting so tied in knots over saying what's right or wrong to a specific guideline. And I think that's, like I say, I think that's part of the problem because it's such a dynamic situation.
Yeah, it's the really difficult thing. And what these racing rules try to do for, say, when someone's attacking on the outside, is they try to say how advanced you need to be in order to be entitled to that room. And this is why I say it's kind of a heuristic thing. I think that the most incidents, with the experience I've got from covering racing, following racing, and racing as a fat amateur myself, you can look at most incidents and there'll be some that you'll say no, no, you've run him off, that's not acceptable. Others you say, well, that's live by the sword, die by the sword, because it's, you know, you've come a little bit too late and you've not really earned that position. And there'll be a few where they're sort of right on the borderline where you sort of, oh, that's a bit iffy. But I want to see egregious overstepping of the line to be punished, certainly. But I think the only way you can do it is with that more heuristic approach. So then that becomes a problem because everybody's got a different view of it. And as you say, Scott, there were different experiences. And also I think probably age makes a difference. You know, Josh, you're a lot younger than me. And I'm not saying that in I'm wise and old and you're stupid. What I mean is these things evolve over time. So kind of where it was established in my mind what is and isn't acceptable has probably shifted a little bit. So you kind of get that foundational thing. So probably the way you see it, the way I see it, and the way, say, to use Derek Warwick as the example again, so that there's sort of 3 steps there in age, will be a little bit different, all because of the sort of foundational experience you have if you're involved in motorsport. And that's where I accept my argument does fall down a little bit, because it's very, very hard to codify and get everybody onto the same page, which is why having a permanent stewards panel or an even smaller group of stewards is a way to try at least to tackle that.
You see it on the commentary as well on Sky Sports of Martin Brundle. You know, often he'll be on the side of let them race, or that's a fair move, or that's hard racing. That's how it was back in the day, like you say. So that's definitely a factor. I think one thing you can do with a permanent group of stewards is get a broad range of people. So you're getting some ex-racing drivers from different eras. You're getting people who have a different perspective, non-racing drivers, and you're bringing them together, and almost like a jury in a court, you're getting the majority verdicts from those people. And there'll be people on that panel who think it shouldn't be a penalty, the people who think it should be a penalty. But you'll be taking that expertise and you'll be coming up with the most sensible outcome based on that range of opinion. I think that would be the better way to go.
The thing is, because there can't be the same 4 stewards at every race. And even if they were professional stewards, I wouldn't advocate the same 4 stewards at every single race. It's not the same single person that referees every Premier League match. It's not the same group. It's not even the same group of 4 or 5 referees that referee exactly every single Premier League match, for example. So, or every top level FIFA approved match around Europe or whatever. I'm fine with that. I would like to see a professional body of stewards rather than amateurs in the sense that they are amateur. They're not paid. It's not a professional position to hold, and it should be, because they are our referees. Where I think it's weak is that you don't have that mix of a decent pool of stewards, but it's slightly more refined than it is now, and they're professional. And I still think we have flawed guidelines. So if I look at the overtaking on the outside of a corner one, for example, I see two obvious problems with it. I'll read out what it says on the guidelines that I've got in full, or the guidelines that I've seen. Overtaking on the outside will always be viewed as a more difficult manoeuvre to accomplish. So, to be entitled to be given racing room, including at the exit, when overtaking on the outside, the overtaking car must have the front axle at least alongside the front axle of the other car at the apex of the corner to the exit, be driven in a safe and controlled manner through the manoeuvre, and be able to make the corner within track limits. There are two things wrong with that as far as I'm concerned. One, I don't like that you have to have the front axle at least alongside the front axle of the other car at the apex and to the exit. That is basically making it impossible to overtake around the outside. It's really, really difficult to do that. I actually quite like Karun Chandok's suggestion that if you've got 75% of your car alongside, then, or, if you're 75% of the way alongside on the entry, you deserve to be given racing room. I really like that. I don't see what apex and exit have to do with it, because all you're doing then is just creating problems through the corner.
And you have to remember that an overtaking move isn't just simply in one corner. And what you just mentioned there is important, because if you're on the outside, you should get a better exit, because the car on the inside will have to take a tighter turn, will be more traction limited. So there's a kind of complete phase of the overtake that runs down the next straight as well, depending on the corner type, how extreme that effect is. But that's why this kind of, step one, be here by the apex, step two, be here at the exit. It's a fluid track. So yeah, it's a fluid situation of the cars on the track, that is, whereby you can't break down always and overtake into those phases only.
Yeah, so that's why I think if you switched it and it was 75% of the car alongside, or front wheels alongside the mirrors or something like that on the entry to the corner, then it immediately means through the whole corner, the car on the inside just has to not... There comes a point where the car on the inside has to be reasonable through the duration of the corner. Whereas if you're putting the onus on the car on the outside to be alongside the other car all the way around a corner to the exit, I just think... I don't see how that encourages racing, and I don't see how it encourages anything other than quite aggressive defending on the inside that makes it impossible to overtake. And I don't think that's what these guidelines should achieve. The other thing I dislike is I think there needs to be a reference when overtaking on the outside. There needs to be a reference to the behaviour of the car defending on the inside. The car defending on the inside should have to be able to make the corner. I'm not saying that if the car on the inside doesn't make the corner, that is complete freedom to just drive off track and overtake off the circuit. I don't actually know fully what I think about Lando Norris's tactic around the outside of Verstappen at Austin, because it's very clear once he realises he's going off, he plants the throttle very early, because that is so obvious in the behaviour of the car. I don't think that should be encouraged, but I think there has to at least be because that will just... requiring the driver defending on the inside to keep their own car on track, one, is a basic satisfaction of fair racing for starters. Two, it fits in with the sporting regulations or the ISC about not leaving the track without a justifiable reason, keeping the car within track limits at all times. And then the third part of it just helps with that element of, is the car on the inside controlled at all times? Because if they're having to make sure they don't go four wheels off the track, it's just an extra thing that they have to bear in mind. And it just tones down that potential for over-aggression slightly. Those would be my two changes. I wouldn't have it alongside the other car all the way through the corner to the exit. And I would have a stipulation in there for what the car on the inside needs to do.
Yeah, that seems like a reasonable modification. We've talked about this at quite some length and do have some other questions to get to. But I think the important thing is that the guidelines that Scott has explained are those that are in place. So any kind of judgment as to what happened has to be looked at within the context of those. If you then want to argue they should be changed or whatever, you don't like what you see, that's fine. But yeah, Verstappen by the letter of the guidelines was fine. And like I say, it's very, very, very good to always have those guidelines in mind and be able to play to them, because that's a racing advantage, and that's one of the reasons why he's so good.
And it's down to the other drivers to do better and to basically beat him in his own game and go to those rules better. And probably for the teams to understand as well. One thing that stood out to me was that, according to Andrea Stella, everyone on the McLaren pit wall thought that was going to be a penalty for Verstappen, or it was not going to be a penalty basically for Norris. Now, obviously, that could be partly just sort of making the case of something they wanted.
That's a good impartial judgment panel.
Yeah, if that is true, though, then maybe, because that then impaired their judgment on swapping back the places, which then Norris arguably could have overtaken Verstappen legally later on in the race. Now, you can argue it both ways. Maybe he wouldn't have done. But that's something the teams need to consider as well. If they probably understand these guidelines, that's going to inform the calls they make, which in the case of the race on Sunday did have a tangible difference.
Yeah, exactly. Very much so. Teams and drivers, regardless of what role they play in the attack or the defence or whatever, definitely need to be fully on top of those. We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first, let me tell you about Grammarly. Your time and expertise are valuable, and with professionals spending nearly half the work week on written communication, focus is one of the most important things to have at work. With Grammarly as your AI writing partner, you can stay focused and get through your work faster with relevant, real-time suggestions wherever you write. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features, like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. And best of all, Grammarly works across 500,000 apps and websites, allowing you to work smarter, not longer. For 15 years, Grammarly has helped professionals do more with their writing. So what are you waiting for? Get more done with Grammarly. Download Grammarly free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
This episode is brought to you by Merrill. We all have goals, and we all want to get to those goals, whether that's saving for a home renovation, that once-in-a-lifetime trip to your favourite Grand Prix, or even retirement. We all want a straightforward path to those goals, but the real world doesn't usually work that way. Merrill understands that. That's why with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalised plan and a clear path forward. And having the bull at your back helps your whole financial life move with you. So when your plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
Right, let's move on to some other questions now. Josh, a question from Nabil about the title fight. Why is F1 so desperate to force a title fight narrative? Lando Norris has hardly put Max Verstappen under any pressure all season, and the points gap remains consistently large. There is no title fight.
I'd be hypocritical if I criticised F1 for this, because I've been driving it up for weeks and months across the race website and podcast and everything. I think there is a title fight. When it's as close as this, when the competition of the cars is so close, I think there's a title fight. It might be a distant one, and it might be one that is heavily favoured towards one driver, but for as long as Norris has a car capable of winning races, capable really of winning all the remaining races, that's, I think, definitely not going to happen, but he does have a car capable of winning each of those races, and with a gap that could feasibly be closed. Like I say, it's unlikely, but I think there is a distant title fight there, and it's completely within F1's interests, and to be honest, the race's interests and everyone working in the sport, to be infused and excited about there being a title fight. I think it's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and everyone wants a title fight, don't they? So sometimes there's a bit of wishful thinking, isn't there? All fans would want a title fight, but
It feels like a long time. I think the long calendars as well, it makes it feel like it's been longer since there's been one, even it was only 21, but it feels like an awful long time since, we've had a proper title fight.
Yeah, a lot of races. And connected to that is the next question, Scott, from Adam Barton, who asks, regardless of whether Norris is in a championship fight, should he be in a championship fight?
Yeah, because he's had a faster car than Verstappen's had, I think, for more of the season. Certainly will have by the time we get to the end of the year, I reckon. And when that's the reality, it's a disappointment if you're not in the championship fight proper. I think Norris should be closer than he is. I think some of that's down to him. Some of it's down to McLaren. It's certainly a very small amount of it is down to team orders, but nowhere near as much of it down to team orders as it is around McLaren execution or Norris execution. I think Norris will have learned a lot from this season, and if he has a car that's capable of fighting for wins from the start of 2025, he needs to put together a full-on title assault next year. Otherwise, this will have all been in vain. And yeah, the way it is at the moment, I disagree with some narratives I've seen that Norris should be champion this year, and that people backing Norris to overhaul Verstappen because it's not in his control really. You can't just assume that the McLaren is going to be the fastest car at every single circuit. Austin was a good example of the fact that it wasn't. I think Norris did a great job in qualifying, but that wasn't a race that he should have won. But he made his life unnecessarily hard, didn't he, by forfeiting track position at turn one? Max was overly aggressive, in my opinion, because he quite literally crossed the line at turn one. But Lando shouldn't have left the door open the way that he did. There have been too many mistakes really to maximise the potential that this season ultimately had. And he hasn't made the progress he's needed to. So is he in a championship fight? I mean, I see what Josh is saying. I mean, based on what we've discussed on the podcast previously, Ed, I haven't viewed it as a championship fight purely from the perspective of I don't think Norris is going to get close enough for it to ever really become in jeopardy for Verstappen. But there is a championship fight because he's not a million miles away and he's more than mathematically in contention. So it isn't just a case of, if he wins all the remaining races and Verstappen's outside the top 6 in the remaining races, Norris could still win it. It's much more realistic than that, but it's not realistic enough for me to have ever gone, he should do this. Whereas McLaren, for example, in the constructors, I forget how many races ago it was now, but we were saying quite a long way before they took the lead in the constructors that they should win the Constructors' Championship this year. That was very different.
Yeah, I think this connects to the first question because I think it's just a small difference in how you view it, in that I don't think anyone's been forcing a title fight narrative. It's just a question of whether it's a really live title battle, as some would frame it, which is legitimate, or as I would have framed it, it's the phase when Norris is trying to get close enough for it to be a proper title battle, which he's not been able to do. But in terms of should he have been in, you can point to 5 or 6 races that there was an opportunity for him to win. But for various reasons, not just him, he didn't. So he absolutely could be on a similar number of points to Verstappen. Now, another question related to that I'll take from Jake Wilkins. If Max had been in a McLaren this year, would he be world champion? I think you'd have to say there's a good chance of that. He'd have still been limited by the times when the team's lack of battle hardenedness cost him a little bit. But he is relentlessly good, Verstappen. And I mentioned those 5 or 6 opportunities to win a race where Norris didn't. I think you could certainly say Verstappen would have won 2 or 3 of those. And each one of those is a significant point swing. So that would change the title fight. So would Max be world champion in the McLaren? Probably yes. Anyone going to disagree on that?
Who's in the Red Bull? That's the question. Who's taken Max's place?
Well, that's the thing.
Is he beating himself?
Not Max Verstappen.
Then that 57-point gap is probably going to be a lot less to close. So yeah, for me, Max would have won it in the McLaren.
You agree on that, Scott?
Yeah, I'd agree on that. It actually reminds me a little bit of not the way the season has played out hasn't been exactly the same trajectory-wise or narrative-wise, but it reminds me a little bit of when Hamilton was up against Vettel in the Mercedes-Ferrari battles in 17 and 18. I always had a suspicion that Hamilton might have won those world titles in the Ferrari.
Certainly 18, I think.
Yeah.
You can make a very strong case on that.
Yeah, 18 is probably the one that I'm thinking of. It must be, because that was when I was around. I wasn't around properly in 17 in F1 circles anyway, so it must have been 2018. Yeah, it has a little bit of that about it, I think, which I think speaks volumes for the quality of Verstappen's season.
And shifting topics a little bit, but again, stuff emerging from Austin. Josh, a question from Andrew Heyer. Is Franco Colapinto a future world champion?
Oh, I love that question. It's I'm like we're looking very far into the future. I think it's a bit way too early to say that, but he's certainly, hopefully, going to be a future Grand Prix driver beyond the end of this year, because he's been fantastic and deserves a seat next year. I'm not sure he's going to get one, but I'm really hoping he'll be there the year after.
Yeah, I think he absolutely deserves to be in Formula 1. He could have a very, very good Formula 1 career. I wouldn't say future world champion, but there's only been 34 of those, so that's a very, very high accolade.
I think he's he should absolutely be a Grand Prix driver, full-time Grand Prix driver.
Yeah.
At some point. I think he's done more than enough now. He's his performances. I was actually talking to someone about this at the weekend. It got me thinking about when he did the Silverstone FP1 earlier this year, and I remember being just really surprised by how much he impressed in Friday practice. I remember we discussed it quite a lot at the time. I'd followed him quite closely. It caught my eye enough to want to speak to Williams about him properly, and even sort of Williams were like, "Oh, that was." Everything about the way he handled that was actually really good. And I remember writing at the time that he was sort of I can't remember how he framed it, Josh, you might remember, but it was like he was like the surprise standout or something like that from the FP1 debutants or whatever we would have called them. And because Behrman was there, Hadjar was in the Red Bull, blah, blah, blah. And but the way his cameo has gone, I would never have imagined that when he stepped into the car. I thought he would prove it was the right decision to replace Sargent with him, and I thought he had a high enough upside for it to be interesting. But this is beyond that. And the reason it got me thinking about the Silverstone FP1 and then the piece we did afterwards was it's just like it's the most accidental bit of foresight I think I've ever done in my career, because I look back on it now and I could absolutely throw that around and go, oh yeah, but I saw his potential back in FP1. I would like to clarify right now, I did not. I did not think when I was impressed by that FP1 outing and we went, we made the effort to do that piece. I did not think, and if you put him in a car this season, Williams, he'll start outperforming Alex Albon and he'll quite consistently score points. I did not think that was on the cards.
In your defence, you were really glowing about what you saw in the FP1, and after speaking to Williams, I distinctly remember you being quite really positive about what they'd said about him, and it kind of stood out because it felt way more than just an obligatory FP1 outing for a young driver. It felt like, wow, he's actually been really impressive. And you mentioned Hadjar as well. It was quite a big contrast between what he did in Red Bull, really kind of cautious, not wanting to bin the car, and the job Colapinto did, I think, really stood out to them and I think made a big difference.
I think all it shows is that all the drivers who are capable of running at the front in Formula 2 and Formula 1, even though Formula 2 can be very, very random and is having quite a weird year this year in particular, they're all quick. And they're all drivers who, if you put them in identical machinery, they wouldn't be far off each other. The field spread would actually probably be quite low. But F1 demands something of a driver that exposes the worst kind of traits and really, really rewards certain good traits as well. And there's something about the way that Williams is, maybe the way that this situation has arisen where Colapinto doesn't have a huge amount to lose. The bit that he does have to lose is if he does have a small chance of getting himself an F1 drive in the near future or whenever. Obviously, these races will count for everything. But he wasn't fighting for a 25 Williams seat, for example, or something like that. Whether there's something about this generation of car, whatever it is, he's stepped up, he has applied himself fantastically well, coped with the situation brilliantly, approached the situation brilliantly, and proven himself to not just be quick over one lap, but capable of actually putting together full stints and run races intelligently. And that is what marks him out as a driver who, the question was, is he a future world champion? Impossible to say, but I am certain Franco Colapinto has proven himself to be capable of being a better Grand Prix driver than I reckon 99% of people who had ever heard of him thought he would be. And I don't mean that in an insulting way, but the level he has shown in these races is higher than I think anyone could possibly have ever rated him.
And if he doesn't become champion, I think that's no slight on him. Look at the quality of this grid right now, and you think people like Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz they're probably never going to be world champion either. But and that says so much about the quality of the field. So it's no disrespect to Franco, but I'll say he's not a future world champion, but hopefully, like I say, a future Grand Prix driver.
Yeah, and he's certainly somebody who, the way it started, you can see him racking up. He could easily have a 200 Grand Prix career or more. That's the kind of thing, somebody who's always in demand, and you have to be very, very good to last that long in Formula One. Scott, a bit of a mashup of a question on a similar topic, but I've thrown in bits from Mark Martin, Nick of Oz, Kevin Hageman, Matthew Clegg and James Proudfoot. Has the performance of Franco Colapinto forced Williams to reassess their confidence in Albon's abilities? And did we overestimate Albon's performances alongside Nicholas Latifi and Logan Sargent? And has Colapinto got in Albon's head?
I do wonder how much of a wobble Albon's having at the moment. I don't think he needs to be concerned about being displaced within Williams imminently. But with Carlos Sainz coming in next year and James Vowles having courted Sainz so publicly, so extensively, and the way that he's waxed lyrical about him, he has about Albon as well. He's called Albon a world champion level driver, or driver who's put in world champion level performances. But he's spoken really highly of Sainz. There is a chance that Albon gets displaced as Williams' favoured son in the medium to long term. Depends how he performs against Sainz. And this doesn't help because this puts pressure on him in advance of 2025. It creates a narrative externally, but also a situation internally where Albon has to start proving himself a little bit, and he hasn't had to do that at Williams. I don't think we overestimated his performances against Latifi and Sargent purely because both of those drivers were front-running drivers in junior categories. And Sargent in particular had a very interesting upside to him. On his day, he could be incredibly quick. But what I was saying before about how F1 exposes some deficiencies and rewards certain strengths, Sargent's a driver for whom F1, I think, exposed some particular weaknesses. Just drawing things together, maybe how you work within a team potentially as well, and how you compartmentalise different pressures and viewpoints and how your mindset is kind of affected. Just that seems that side of things beat Sargent down effectively over time. It just meant that he was always on that kind of ragged side. Because you can't overstate it. Albon obliterated Latifi and Sargent. This wasn't Albon, edging two mediocre F1 drivers, bad F1 drivers, whatever you want to call them, and then being held up as some kind of hero for doing it. He absolutely destroyed them. They never had a chance against him. And nobody would have expected Colapinto to come in. Vowles and Williams would not have expected Colapinto to come in and perform at the level he has versus Albon. So it would be very interesting to know what's happening at Williams behind the scenes at the moment in trying to understand what it is that has allowed Franco to come in and be so impressive. And potentially at the same time, is there something that's holding Albon back? Obviously, there's been a run of races since the summer break where they've changed the car, they've upgraded the car, and you would think that Albon will be able to go with that and impress. But maybe there's something that is catching Albon out a little bit and warping the picture slightly. I think we need the full sample set of 2024 races of Albon and Colapinto alongside each other to really know. Right now, I think there's a dip in Albon's stock at Williams and externally, but it's not a fatal one. It's not a fundamental one, irreversible or anything like that. But if he gets to the end of the year and Colapinto has been as good or better than him, then I think it will be quite a long winter for Albon, waiting for 2025 to start so that he can try and put it right against Sainz.
Yeah, there's a little bit of circumstances playing into it. The fan in Q3 in Baku, the upgrade, they struggled a little bit with that only Albon had in Singapore. Austin was a funny one, actually. They both underachieved in qualifying. In fact, I think over the course of that weekend, they didn't make the most of the car. Colapinto in sprint qualifying did, and then he executed the race while Albon, of course, made the mistake. They had a spin each in one in sprint qualifying for Albon when he hit the curb too hard, and the other for Colapinto in main qualifying. So, there was probably a bit left on the table there. But yeah, Colapinto is a much tougher teammate, and the higher quality teammate you've got, the less clear gap there is, which is why when you're trying to assess drivers, it's not just that you look at. A question related to the driver market from Andrew Wilson and James Mellier that I'll take. What's the latest news on the final seat at Sauber? Is there any chance of Colapinto getting it, potentially via a loan deal, or is Bottas or somebody else preferred? What role will Colapinto get if he doesn't get a seat? Well, if Colapinto doesn't get a seat, he will be Williams' reserve. He's got quite a long-term deal with them, so that's where he'll be if he doesn't have a seat. Audi still haven't quite decided. There's the framework of a deal with Bottas. There's no problems about length of terms or value and stuff. There's been stories about that, but that's not a problem. If Audi said yes to Bottas, then the deal would be done and could be done and announced in pretty much minutes. So it comes down to what do Audi want? Yes, they are looking at alternatives. They've spoken with Colapinto. They seem to have gone a bit cold on him recently. Gabriel Bortoletto, who's on McLaren's books, they like, and there's basically this decision that needs to be made across Mattia Binotto and the board about do they go with the experience of Bottas or do they go with the youthful promise of Bortoletto if they can extract him from McLaren and Bortoletto wants to go there, or if they can't get him and they want to go for Colapinto. So that's where it's kind of at the moment, but some very, very, very nervous times, I think, for Valtteri Bottas. Josh, connected to that question from Professor Gratz, he says, I'm proposing a free agent redo. I was thinking the driver who played the market perfectly was Nico Hülkenberg, who snagged that Sauber seat early. If you put him and that seat back on the market today, would that seem like an exciting signing, or might he be sitting there like Valtteri Bottas? If nothing else, the team would be in more of a negotiating position, and who knows if Williams might prefer Franco Colapinto rather than pay up for a couple of years of Carlos Sainz.
I reckon Williams would still go after Carlos Sainz, just because of what Scott said about how Vals was really, really interested in getting Sainz, and I think that's such a big signing, you don't ignore that, and they'd still make that deal today. Hülkenberg's interesting. One of you two can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know he was fine to stay at Haas basically, but they wouldn't give him a deal. Hulkenberg, I think, still probably would have gone for that 3-year deal, but again, maybe that's a bit more of a toss-up, and obviously if he stays at Haas, then where does Esteban Ocon go? Probably he maybe takes that Sauber seat, so I think there could have been differences, but also I think it could have literally gone exactly the same way if those key players were free agents still.
Oh, clearly the whoever it is that's working outside where you're recording, Josh, massively disagrees with you. Well, they're cancelling you. Was that them you pressing the buzzer?
They're drilling through to change my answer, yeah.
I think the one thing that I think would be interesting if there was, let's say, a free agency freeze until July 31st or the end of August or whatever, Hülkenberg might end up staying at Haas, because it's not impossible that Mattia Binotto comes in at Audi and doesn't want Hülkenberg, even if there was an agreement in principle or advanced negotiations or whatever this free agency freeze would facilitate in terms of conversations. You wouldn't necessarily. I don't think Haas would necessarily throw out Hülkenberg out of contract and jump at Esteban Ocon. I can see them wanting a Nico Hülkenberg, Ollie Behrman lineup for next year. I think that would be perfect for them because then they get the continuity. And the problem, you mentioned it, Josh. I think you're right. But the specific of it was that Gene Haas has no interest in being forced into driver negotiations, basically. So Audi were obviously knocking on the door with Hülkenberg very, very early this season, and Gene wouldn't be forced into it. So it wasn't that Haas didn't want to propose. Like, the team itself wanted to keep Hülkenberg, and I think had a rough idea of what would be required to keep him, but they couldn't formally have the negotiation. Whereas obviously in the world in which the free agency stuff waits until the second half of the year and then Haas can go to the table, if Audi is suddenly less keen and Haas are dead keen, I could see Hülkenberg being kept on there. I could also, in the world of the Red Bull driver chaos, I can see Hülkenberg emerging as an emergency Red Bull option in place of Perez or something like that.
Yeah, it's been so fluid, this driver market, that if you stop things happening earlier on, who knows what kind of consequences you would have got. But I do think Audi were quite keen on having a German driver, so I still suspect he might have ended up being signed there. Well, Mick Schumacher's the other option. I think Mattia Binotto was largely being polite about him, saying they were evaluating him. But yeah, he's an option. I mean, he's a perfectly competent Grand Prix driver.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Right, let's go through a few more now in this final part. Scott, a question from Stephen Long. As an American, I've always loved COTA because it's a real racetrack with a great environment and quality racing. Do you think this event has lost any of its status since Miami and Las Vegas were added to the calendar? I find those races to be gimmicky and Austin to be underrated because of it.
I think it's actually helped Austin with those races arriving because it has enhanced Austin's position as the real race in the USA. You've got the glitz and glamour of Vegas and Miami and the commercial appeal and the VIP appeal there. And there's still a lot of that for COTA, but because of the reasons outlined in Stephen's question, the interesting racetrack, the good racing that it can create, it's almost become the purists' American F1 race, even though this is also a race that leans heavily into local cultures and even stereotypes at times and has been seen as gimmicky itself in the past. No, I think it's only strengthened Austin. It's shown why if the F1's going to have more American races, it needs some of them to be more like Austin than like Vegas and Miami.
Josh, a question from Sack 1942. Any F1 seat is a massive prize, but is there not a degree of concern for sending a driver as talented as Ollie Behrman to Haas, which even with the new Toyota support is basically in last place for resources?
I don't think so. I think it would be a great place for Behrman to have an apprenticeship. Haas has sorted out its mid-season development problems as well, so he'll get used to having a car that develops through the season, which isn't always been the case at Haas. And I think we've seen some great drivers in really bad teams at the start of their career, and they've been completely fine. And Haas is by no means on anywhere near the same level as some of those teams. Look at Alonso Minardi, Haas is a big step up from there. So I think Behrman will be completely fine.
Question from George Vandini that I'll take. It's often said that if every team got 100% out of their car, Haas would finish last. But I was wondering if this did happen, which team do you think would win the championship? Yeah, that's a good question. I often refer to that sort of thing. I think there's currently 3 teams that are basically the same in terms of the ultimate performance potential, which is Mercedes, Ferrari and Red Bull. They're all effectively works teams, well-resourced, great facilities. And come 2026, I think Aston Martin joins that group. So it's currently one of those 3 and then one of those 4 once Aston Martin's in there. And that's when the drivers and the execution and that kind of thing comes into it. So, yeah, that's why I think McLaren are doing a very good job, because I just put them just that fraction behind that. I don't think it's a huge disadvantage anymore to not be a works team, but there's that little slight reduction in opportunity. So I think the 100% of those 3 teams at the moment, Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull, is that tiny smidgen higher than McLaren, but McLaren would still be there, just barely behind them, but just. So yeah, that's well within the noise, because nobody, of course, will get 100% out of their potential. Scott, a question from Joe Andrews. Zhou Guanyu has had another poor race in Austin. Why hasn't he been replaced, and why aren't his continued poor performances being talked about?
I think his poor performances are being talked about because he's not going to get an F1 seat next season, and we've never advocated that he really should. When he has come up, when these conversations have happened around the Sauber seat, for example, we've basically pointed out why we don't think Joe's in the picture. It's just he's the 19th or 20th, well, certainly now that Sargent's gone, he's the 19th or 20th best driver in F1, which means he's the worst or the second worst driver in F1, depending on how you slice the season. So there's not a huge amount to talk about, especially because he's going to lose the drive at the end of the year anyway, and his time's up. In terms of why he hasn't been dropped now, and why I suspect why we haven't been pushing, or not pushing for, but when there's talk about driver changes, sometimes they make sense and sometimes they don't. And Zhou Guanyu is not the reason that Sauber hasn't scored any points this season. So yeah, he might have the occasional absolute stinker, and this is probably the worst of his 3 years in Formula One in terms of certainly his machinery, but also his own performances within that, I would say, as well. But I don't see what it would achieve by binning him off before the end of the year, especially when Sauber's made it crystal clear it doesn't take Théo Pourchaire seriously as an F1 prospect. If Pourchaire was an actual contender for a race seat next year, then binning off Zhou for Pourchaire would make sense. But I think it's become very clear, hasn't it, that Sauber's got no intention of putting Pourchaire anywhere near its F1 cars unless it absolutely has to. Just look at the fact that Rob Schwartzman's been given another FP1 session. And I don't think Pourchaire's had one this year, has he? And I don't think he's getting one now.
No, exactly. And the reason it's not been a big discussion point is because it's been clear for a long time he won't be re-signed for next year, but it's also been clear they won't replace him before the end of the season. And when they talk about replacements of other drivers, when we talk about that as a news story, it's because they're considering doing it. Sauber have never considered doing it, and that's because that they've had him locked in, and yeah, they don't need to change it. Joe's been unlucky. He's acquitted himself very creditably in Formula One, but he's been destined for the exit for some time. Josh, a question from David Trippier. It feels like we've got some rather enjoyable sprints this season. Is the format proving to work a bit better now, or do sprints simply benefit from the fact that the whole season has been super competitive anyway?
I suspect it's more to do with the season and the tracks. So Austin is a really good venue for a sprint race. We saw some fantastic racing, and that was because the track was really good and the cars were really close, and there was various factors like Carlos Sainz charging through in a faster Ferrari, which meant we got a better race. So yeah, I think it's more to do with the competitiveness and the tracks, which I think they've on the whole picked some pretty good tracks for racing this year. Brazil is always a good one.
Question I'll take now from Rowlin. Of all the tracks that have held a Grand Prix on US soil, past and present, where does COTA rank for racing and overall spectacle? It's a really good question. A lot of tracks have held Grand Prix in the USA. And do you know what? I actually think COTA might be the best one. It's great for racing, brilliant events. It is a lovely track. I love the high-speed S's section in the first part of the lap. And basically, its competition is there's a load of street races, which are great. I mean, Long Beach obviously stands out. Great event, great spectacle. But I'd still maybe say COTA shades it. Watkins Glen was a great, venerable venue, but actually I think COTA beats that. The only one I would say that does eclipse COTA is the Anomaly. And that's the fact that, of course, in the 1950, the first 11 years of the World Championship, the Indy 500 was technically a round of the World Championship, even though in real terms it wasn't. So I would say the Indianapolis 500 is the one that's the greatest event and greatest spectacle, because it's arguably the greatest race in the world. But yeah, in terms of real F1 World Championship, COTA, I think they've done it. Brilliant circuit. Scott, a question from Rick Steen. Is Red Bull deliberately tanking the World Constructors' Championship because finishing lower means more wind tunnel time in the final year before a major rule change?
No, that'll be the silver lining from what has been a very frustrating year. But it'll only be a silver lining if they truly understand what it is they've got wrong and what potential limitations they've found in some of their machinery, like the wind tunnel, which, as Christian Horner loves to say, is a relic of the Cold War and has a lot of specific limitations as a result of that. It's awkward to use. It's a bit unreliable outside of a pretty narrow weather range as well in terms of ambient temperature, I think I'm right in saying. So no, they're not deliberately tanking it. They're nosediving in the World Championship because they've got things wrong on their car and because they only have 1.5 cars in the fight most of the time, as evidenced by Sergio Perez being beaten by a Mercedes that started from the pit lane in Austin. So it could end up being helpful for them that they get a bit more of that wind tunnel and CFD work next year, but that's certainly not what they're aiming for right now, especially because all of the bonuses and prize money and sponsor glory that comes with being World Constructors Champion. It matters a lot more to the teams than the narrative around it usually suggests, because quite fairly, I don't think fans get particularly excited by it.
Josh, a question from Mark Watts now. Could F1 take inspiration from IndyCar and NASCAR by having rolling formation starts for sprint races? It would help to add jeopardy to and differentiate from what often ends up as just a spoiler for how the first into the main race will pan out.
I was previously against this. I wouldn't be too offended if they added it, to be honest. It would add a different element to the sprint races. But I always like a proper standing start for F1. I think it's what's right for the series. I think on the spoiler point, to be fair, if you look at Austin, I think the sprint race wasn't too much of a spoiler for the main race because of the parc fermé changes they're able to make in between. If you look at the sprint, I expected Red Bull and Verstappen to be much stronger in the Grand Prix, and then obviously they weren't nearly as strong. So I'm not too concerned about the spoiler element. I think the Parc Fermé change has basically fixed that element, and actually it's actually quite a fun experience through the weekend to see the pecking order between the top 4 teams change over the weekend. I think it actually adds quite an interesting element, and I think since that change, I've enjoyed these sprint weekends far more than when they were first introduced.
Yeah, it's been an improvement this year. Certainly. A question now, well, it's from Christopher Partridge, but actually he sent in a couple of questions from his children. Now, there was a question from Hannah that we kind of included in the first parts of the podcast when we were talking about the racing rules, so we've addressed that. Thanks for that one, Hannah. And James, who is 12 apparently, asks, why are Aston Martin failing in all the races? Yeah, good question. Fundamentally, it comes down to the car not being good enough. Even at Austin, where Alonso managed to qualify 8th, he shouldn't really have been in Q3, and then he was a couple of places higher up even once in Q3 because he did get his one run in Q3 just before the final runs properly started. So he was the only one who effectively in that second run window got a lap in, so that allowed him to start ahead of a couple of people, and in the race just regressed to the mean because the car's not quick enough. He was kind of able to keep it there on the street circuits in Baku and Singapore, but not Kota. They're continuing to upgrade the car without glorious results, so they're just a little bit confused, I think, technically, and generating unwanted characteristics. They're adding performance, but just not as quickly as others, hence why they've regressed initially from hanging on to the coattails of the top 4. They're now behind Haas. I think they're behind Williams in terms of performance, even though Williams didn't deliver. Quite often close with RB, but even seem to be a bit behind them. So yeah, difficult times for Aston Martin. Scott, question from Simon Russell. Has age finally caught up with Lewis Hamilton?
Maybe in qualifying. We'll get an answer, I think, next year when he moves to Ferrari and gets into a different team. The qualifying thing's difficult to judge just purely because obviously there have been moments where Hamilton's been perfectly good in qualifying, and you wouldn't say that the age is a problem at all, but it's hard to know whether a tiny bit of speed has gone away for whatever the potential reasons could be associated with age. Reactions not necessarily, but whatever it could be in terms of the micro judgments that are being made throughout a qualifying lap or whatever. Whether it's that, whether it's adjusting to this particular set of car rules and the things that he doesn't quite like about it, especially over one lap, whether 10 years ago he might have adjusted better. The way that the tyres are in terms of their warm-ups, so many drivers and teams talk in the last couple of years in particular. It's been a prominent issue for a long time, but the last couple of years I've heard more about tyre warm-up and peaky tyres over a lap in qualifying than ever before. Maybe there's something specifically within that Hamilton's that's relevant in terms of Hamilton's age, but it's very, very difficult to know. I mean, it's hard to make the Hamilton's still great in races argument after Austin, given he crashed out early on. And I don't necessarily believe Mercedes boss Toto Wolff's very, very emphatic. It definitely wasn't Hamilton's fault. We've got a problem with the car. There was a reference, I think, to there being a gust of wind, for example, which, maybe the car comes into that because it's hypersensitive to it or whatever. It was clearly unusual, but it was also a mistake from Hamilton as well. I think the evidence is overwhelming that he's still very good on Sunday. So I don't think ages can. It's not like ages. I hate the phrase, but he's not washed, and I don't think age has completely eradicated him as a force at the front in Formula One. But in terms of whether he is still capable of his absolute best over an entire season, I think he needs to get out of Mercedes for us to find out, because there's just various things that keep going wrong there, and the team's not exactly completely in the ascendancy anymore either, is it? So yeah, change your scenery and maybe we'll get a better answer.
Josh, question from Lisa Smith. Does Charles Leclerc have a mathematical possibility of winning the championship? And related to that, Karma Streaks asks, how badly are Ferrari going to be kicking themselves over blowing it at Baku, given how they'd very much be in the hunt for the Constructors' Championship if they hadn't?
My maths has 146 points available for the rest of the season, which may or may not be wrong. Leclerc is 79 points off the lead, so yes, he's firmly in mathematical contention. In fact, well inside it. But I'm not going to claim this is going to be a distant title fight. I don't think Leclerc is in title contention. He is in contention to overhaul Norris, though. He's only 22 points behind, so perfectly feasible with a better 5 races that Leclerc could easily finish the season as the runner-up. I mean, on the second part of the question with to do with Baku, I don't think they'll be kicking themselves. I've been quite impressed with Ferrari on a lot of occasions this year. Their strategy, say at Monza, for example, as a race, they really had no right to win, and they did. So I think over the course of the season, they can be pretty pleased with themselves. I think, and this is only off memory, I think their kind of execution has probably been better than McLaren. So I think Ferrari can be fairly pleased with themselves.
I think they'd be more kicking themselves over Singapore, wouldn't they?
Yeah. I mean, there's an opportunity there as well. Although I think to add another thing they'll be kicking themselves over, it was just the fact that the Spain upgrade went wrong, because that required some adjustment too, although it then leads to them making a few little changes about the way they do things. Little bit of work in the wind tunnel in terms of improving that facility, so that was kind of almost a necessary thing to go through. So yeah, they still could get in the Constructors' Championship fight. It's going to be hard, but yeah, certainly possible.
They would be without that upgrade stumble, wouldn't they?
Yep.
Probably without that, they're probably in the lead right now and have a pretty good grip on it. And Leclerc, he's probably not in the Drivers' Championship lead, but I think closer to Verstappen than Norris is right now.
They've had too many of the anomalous, rotten weekends, haven't they? It's not just things like the upgrade going wrong in terms of what it meant for a run of races. It's also things like how bad Canada was. I think Silverstone was really bad for them as well, wasn't it? And then Singapore. You know, these are the moments where, you know, McLaren and Red Bull have had issues every now and again, but it's usually either one car or it's, you know, just an underachievement in terms of the end result. But Ferrari have basically had entire weekends go missing, more or less.
Yeah, and that's where Baku came from, obviously, because Leclerc could have won and Sainz should have been on the podium. So there were quite a few points lost there. And the final question I'll take from Andreas Hjalmarsson. Is the US Grand Prix result evidence that Ferrari has solved its car issues? And do you think that Lewis Hamilton has changed his mind one more time about joining Ferrari? Well, I think it does show that they've solved that particular issue. There was a concern that it was just the fact the car was strong on street tracks and low downforce that led to that little purple patch, but COTA is a good test of the car and it worked well. It didn't have the porpoising problems. They had a bit of bottoming out problem in the S's, but a number of cars had that. That's quite common there. So yeah, I think things are nice and stable there. So that particular car issue has been solved. But of course, as happens, you solve one car issue and then the next one moves to the top of the pile. So they've got other things to work on. As Lewis Hamilton, I don't think he will have changed his mind even when Mercedes had that little run, although I'm sure there will have been a bit of him looking at it and thinking, this is a little bit worrying. So I think this will be a wonderful silver lining for Lewis Hamilton. He had a horrible weekend at COTA, but he can look at the team he's going to be in 6 races' time and see they got a 1-2. So I think he'll be very pleased to see that Ferrari's struggle in the middle of the year was a wobble rather than indication of a longer trend. So I'm sure he's content with the decision, particularly with Mercedes continuing to struggle with the car being erratic and swinging in terms of performance from session to session with conditions. Well, thanks very much, Josh and Scott, for this marathon stint of question answering, and thanks to everybody who sent questions in. We've got another race coming up imminently, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the Mexican Grand Prix.
The Athletic.